Hello, and welcome to the NTID ASL lecture series. My name is Dr. Matthew Lin. I'm the chairperson of the NTID Science and Mathematics Department. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Barbara Spiecker. She is the first guest lecturer in this year's ASL lecture series. Barbara received her baccalaureate degree in biology and environmental science here at RIT in 2011. I can remember tutoring organic chemistry, which is my favorite course, and teasing Barbara. All along as a student, Barbara was very mature and strong. Upon graduation with her baccalaureate degree, she started her master's degree at Northeastern University in marine biology. Her research included work in 3 different locations: Massachusetts, Panama, and Washington State. Upon completion of her master's degree, she decided to continue her academic training at Oregon State University in a PhD program majoring in integrative biology. She studied local, influential, and non-local influences on macroalgae population. Last year in 2020, she successfully defended her dissertation and became Dr. Spiecker. She's working as a postdoc at the University of California in Santa Barbara currently. She is studying the kelp forests of California. She also assists in preparing California's state report related to marine protection areas. Barbara has an important role in our deaf community, disseminating scientific news. She collaborated and established a website called Atomic Hands. This website has many videos related to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the fields we refer to as STEM. She is also an ASL science consultant to the Learning Institute. She has published successfully 4 articles within prominent scientific journals. She is now preparing to publish 4 more articles based on her dissertation research. She is a very impressive woman. She lectures, teaches, presents at academic conferences, performs deaf community outreach, works with government agencies, and she's also a reviewer for several professional journals. Welcome, our esteemed RIT alumna, Dr. Barbara Spiecker. We are so proud of your amazing accomplishments.
Your work. Such a nice introduction. You're right. You did tutor me, and since that time, it's been a while, and now I'm back. My name is Barbara Spiecker. My lecture today, I'm going to look at how I, as a deaf person, how I was raised within ASL, but I thought that ASL wasn't really a language. It was just a tool to communicate English with. So this is like for a deaf person like me who can't hear or speak to navigate my way through just using ASL. So in this lecture, I want to focus on my relationship with ASL and how that has changed as I've navigated my way through my life. This is just basically what the lecture will look like. I'll briefly give you a little bit about my background. Then I'll talk about my journey through the marine sciences through an ASL lens. In that, I'll discuss the several important issues, the role of interpreters and what that looks like, the role of a deaf person in the STEM field, using ASL in STEM settings, and how science communication goes across lines. Just briefly about who I am. I'm deaf. I can't hear anything. I come from a deaf family. I have deaf parents. I have 2 deaf brothers. I have 2 deaf uncles and 1 deaf aunt. And the rest of my family all can hear. I was raised signing using ASL. I was born and raised in Rochester, New York, and I went through the School for the Deaf, or the Rochester School for the Deaf. In high school, I split my time half and half. In the mornings, I went into a mainstream program, and the afternoons, I attended RSD. As I was growing up, ASL, I was surrounded by it. My mom typically took us kids camping very often. And I do remember in camping, I loved the nighttime around the campfire where we all told stories and acted out plays. This is Alyssa, and she herself was an expert at storytelling and always encouraged all of us to watch and then create our own little skits to the adults. At night at home, my mom would have books and read them in ASL, and I was fascinated by that. Also, when I was attending RSD, I was involved in the school plays. There was a deaf woman there named Vicky Norquist, who also was a storyteller. I learned so much by watching so many deaf storytellers work. And I was always just yearning to have those thoughts and ideas being able to be told in ASL in such a way. It was so gorgeous. And I wish I could do the same thing. I wish my skill level was the same. I didn't feel like I had that skill level. And this is as a child, I was thinking of being just like them. Now I get to where I am today. I find myself in the area of academic storytelling, if you will. I grew up in what I called social ASL. I had a deaf family. I was in the deaf community within Rochester. I went to the School for the Deaf. And then I also thought there was academic ASL. People in the schools use that, but I hadn't really considered how to express myself in that academic ASL and how within the school that was different from everyday conversational American Sign Language. I hadn't given that a lot of thought yet. I graduated high school. And I went to, like Matt mentioned, I went to RIT NTID, and I majored in biology. Once I got into RIT NTID, that was the first time I was kind of taken aback, that I felt like I was hitting the wall, that there were gaps in my education. And that forced me to really look within and figure out, why am I missing these pieces of information? That's really where my ASL journey started to change. I mean, I had used ASL, but I hadn't really thought about it until I faced it within a college setting. And I really started to realize how important ASL is within an academic setting. I took a deaf art and film class at NTID, and my professor was Patty Durr. And she had asked the students in the class to do a project to express ourselves with Devia, which is an art based on the deaf experience. And this is the first thing that came to my mind. This is what I'm showing here is a piece of my digital art. And it was from my experience of RIT. If you see the professor, obviously very important part of in our lives, the central figure. That art reflects those gaps of information I was missing. You can see me sitting there in the row of students, the professor's in the middle there, and then the interpreter next to them. You can see that the professor is large, the interpreter is small. The professor is giving out the information, 100% of that information. The interpreter is giving out less information, meaning I received even less. So there is a mix of languages going on, which I didn't understand. And you see that whiteboard that is in the picture there with the sentences? You see there are gaps. There are missing pieces in the sentences. And that's where I'm trying to figure out what I'm getting. The professor would be using jargon or like say photosynthesis or large words within the STEM fields. And the interpreters who didn't have enough background content would abbreviate these words. They would abbreviate things like call it PO4 as opposed to phosphorylation, or abbreviate things in ways that I was not getting the vocabulary that the professor was actually giving me, which was quite frustrating. And that sort of was the foundation of my academic career. Again, during my college years, I struggled for information access. Also during that, at RIT, I was studying Cstars, which is a type of C-star. This is a presentation I had to give. I researched it totally, and this is me. This video I'm going to show you is me giving that presentation. Now, mind you, it's 10 years ago. It's myself and Alicia, I believe it's Voten was the last name. We were talking about these C-stars, and I developed this, and I was focusing on the gradation, the levels of them. Again, this is an old presentation. I was talking about their skeletal structure and so forth. You will see I am figure spelling a lot. And I'm using signs that are not contextually accurate. I was using a lot of initialized sign. I had no emotion in my sign, and I was definitely using English word order. I'll show you just to get you a feel of what that looked like. So that video, you see, I'm totally emotionless. I am just basically churning out some signs. There was a lot of information that was missing, but I didn't want to show those gaps in my work. So typically what I would do is write a script out for the presentation, give it to the interpreter, and then I would follow that script word for word to make sure that the interpreter understood me, to make sure the interpretation was clear so that the hearing people would look at me as an intelligent human being. And who did that hurt? It hurt my deaf family, my deaf friends who came to watch me, because they didn't get a lot out of that presentation. And I was perpetuating that cycle of misinformation because I wanted to prove to the hearing people that I was smart. Now, at that time, I felt I was in survival mode. I just was trying to get through. I was constantly playing catch up in a hearing world. I graduated with my bachelor's degree, and I did not want to fail within that system. But I hadn't really developed the potential to really analyze, okay, what are my choices? And what does this mean for me? And how do my choices send out a specific message? I didn't have somebody to sit down and really analyze what my work looks like. I graduated RIT. I took a gap year, I guess, and then I applied to Northeastern University to their graduate program in marine biology. And the program was quite unique because each semester, the cohort would travel to different places to study their ecosystems. There are 15 hearing students, and I was the only deaf. The first semester, we went to Massachusetts, where we were looking at the
Rocky Intercoastal.
There were 5 classes that I took there. They typically were all day. Then the next day you would take another class. So they were 1 day each. And why they were a day each is because we would go out in the field. It was hands-on work. Within that program, I had two DIs, we'll call them, designated interpreters with me that would interpret all day for the entire week. Now, that first semester, I really thought I was going to quit. I felt alone. I felt frustrated. I didn't know how to advocate for myself. I didn't really understand what I needed or how I really even needed to express what I needed. It was a systematic problem. It was an interpreter problem. I hadn't figured out any strategies to work through those frustrations, but I decided to persevere. Within that program, it was a very close knit with each other. I was with these interpreters all through the classes and even through downtime. And during that downtime, I discussed with the interpreters about what things look like. How could we make this work? And the interpreters saw me as a colleague. We worked together. I was really taught a lot about how to analyze my environment, how to analyze the interpreting process during that time. At Northeastern, I was not so much in survival mode anymore. I started to be a bit more comfortable, and my mind actually had more available bandwidth to be able to learn and also to step back and assess my situation. At that point, I started to really search within myself as what it means to be a deaf person who doesn't speak, who does not hear. And I found a newfound confidence in myself. And those who joined me, we worked together as opposed to me dictating anything or information to them or them dictating information to me. The next semester, I was done in Massachusetts, and then I went to Panama. And we were studying coral reefs there. Same two interpreters were my designated interpreters, and they came with me.
After Panama, I went to Friday Harbor on San Juan Island in Washington State.
And there I did a lot of thinking about the experience itself and a lot of discussion with my interpreters of how, what we were finding and what we would have to do within this particular the kelp forest program.
So for 3 semesters, 9 months I had traveled. Now it was time to really roll up my sleeves and work on my research, work on my thesis. So I thought I had experienced the lab, I experienced field work, but one part I hadn't experienced was the theoretical modeling, how everything will look on a computer program and be able to predict the situations I had worked on. So I decided to go ahead and try that.
Myself and my research advisor sat down. The first few meetings, we had an interpreter mediating discussion, and it felt very clunky. And I felt like the interpreter wasn't really helping the communication, but more impeding the communication. The interpreter didn't have enough background knowledge to understand what we were talking about as field experts. So we decided from then on, we would just type back and forth on a Google Doc, or we would chat with one another while on video. Looking back, my time at RIT was very similar. I did research while an undergrad at RIT, and my advisor at RIT, we again started with an interpreter, but the interpreter wasn't a subject matter expert. So I still have these papers from long ago where we would just write back and forth to one another. I just thought, I need to focus on building my fundamental science, philosophy, and approach, and not on language via an interpreter. It was sort of working in a vacuum. I needed to focus on my scientific knowledge without the distraction of a person not understanding me. So doing research without an interpreter and working with my faculty advisor, I published my first paper. It wasn't without its bumps foregoing an interpreter in the room. There was a lot of typing back and forth. I had misgivings about my English. It was never perfect enough for me. We were communicating very quickly back and forth, and I was never certain of my grammar in these text conversations. And at one point, I realized, I need ASL. ASL is the way I express myself. It's not just the way I speak with people, it's the way I express myself as a scientist. So I needed ASL, yet at the same time, I was struggling to express myself as a scientist in ASL. I spent a lot of time reading and writing English. And so, of course, I was signing an English word order, and I never gave myself a chance to just practice how would I express this science in ASL in the most natural way for me as a second generation deaf person to do so. So during my traveling for my graduate degree, I really thought about scientific communication skills. And I thought back to that presentation at RIT, and I thought, wow, my deaf friends and family were completely left out of that conversation. They were excited to learn about my research and support me. And I thought I was using sign language for them, but I wasn't. I was signing for the benefit of the interpreter to make sure that I was understood, to make sure hearing people thought I was intelligent. That was a waste of time, honestly, and I felt really horrible about that. I was forsaking everything that I had grown up with and just sort of kowtowing to the person who was going to be putting my ASL into English, which is completely, I realize, unnecessary. So my journey began at RIT, of course, and I was someone who was just taking in information. I was a passive consumer of communication. I would show up, the interpreter would show up, I would take in information, they would leave. I'd get another interpreter, they would leave. So I never really had a chance to talk to an interpreter, to understand if the interpreter was good, if they were skilled in that area. I never really had a chance to process with the interpreter what was happening in class and how they felt about it. I had deaf classmates, and we would always look at the interpreters and think, wow, this interpreter is amazing. In undergrad, there were some rock star interpreters, and we just thought the world of them. We thought they were language models for us because they were expressing the only ASL that we've ever seen. We thought the interpreters were the authority, and that was my learning experience. I thought the interpreters knew how to do everything, and they knew what that ASL should look like. But that's not the case, I realized, as I matured with my language. I was able to talk more, dialogue more with the interpreters I worked with as a graduate student. And I realized I framed those interpreters wrong. The interpreters weren't the language experts. They weren't the authority in ASL. We have two groups of people, essentially. There are two different languages, and the interpreter is the mediator between those groups. The people involved, the hearing people and the deaf people, are the ones that need the interpretation, but they're the subject matter experts. We should be working as a collaborative team, the three parts of this communication process working together. So from then on, I decided, you know what? I need to become an active participant in my communication, and I need to decide what my experience is going to look like for each situation in which I find myself. So that got me thinking, unpacking a lot, and asking some really deep questions of myself about the interpreting process, my role, the interpreter's role, and what is demanded in each situation of myself and the interpreter and the hearing person. So what does interpreting mean? Are they just language models? Are they mediating language? Do they make decisions for deaf people? What is the interpreter's role and responsibility? Should interpreters show up to a situation, work, and then leave, or should they be more involved? And what would that involvement look like? Who needs an interpreter? Deaf people? Hearing people? How should interpreters identify themselves? And who should they align with? So this leads me to an experience I had. We were out in the field doing field work, and we were out on an island in the middle of nowhere. And this was a kind of situation where we all get really close. The interpreters are seen as people too, and my classmates are close, and I'm close with all of them. And we slept and ate and worked together 24/7. So there was an interesting situation that came to the fore. So the interpreter was talking with hearing people and became really good friends with one of my co-students. Is that appropriate? Or should they always be aligned with me? During downtime, should the interpreter be their own person and do what they want? Or do they always have to be responsible and thinking about the cultural divide that they're trying to diminish? And then the last question, how should interpreters identify themselves? Should they introduce themselves as, hello, I'm an ASL interpreter, or just interpreter, taking away the ASL part? I had an experience that really made me question that. Someone told me, if you say I'm an ASL interpreter, that sent the message of who the person is that needs the interpreter. If you're an ASL interpreter, that means you're an interpreter for deaf people, not for hearing people. ASL interpreter assumes that English is the primary language and ASL is the secondary language. If they just identify themselves as an interpreter, that means they interpret for everyone. They mediate between languages. No one language is superior to the other. Everyone is equal. All languages are equal, and communication can happen. And all people need the interpreter. So that led me to even more questions and even more unpacking as my role as a deaf person. Questions like, so when I'm talking about a topic, what does that look like without the English influence? I have plenty of ASL signs and language. Is that easy to apply to the STEM field? Is that a satisfactory method of doing so? Is fingerspelling, especially in the STEM topics, is fingerspelling the best way to communicate those concepts? Fourthly, as I thought about before, my experience of signing an English word order wasn't for my deaf family and friends. It was to satisfy the hearing people in the room. So I was thinking, as a deaf scientist, I have a responsibility to provide direct access, high quality access for deaf and hard of hearing people to that STEM education. Do we have a responsibility to ourselves and to ASL to constantly improve our communication about ASL topics through ASL? Should we really invest in that development of language and thought in the STEM field via ASL? So that led me to work on this project. So from master's degree to the start of my PhD, I got involved in this project called ASL Clear. It focused on developing signs for STEM topics and how to express them in ASL. When I first joined the group, I thought, well, ASL is not really a language. I was still under that misunderstanding. I had met some similar educated persons who thought the same about ASL. We're all deaf. We think ASL is a tool. I knew ASL was a language, but I didn't really fully accept it and recognize it as a full language equal to English, because so often I had this English superiority forced upon me. Fingerspelling is English. Initialized signs is English. Mouthing those English words. Again, English was all over my ASL. When I had a conversation with an individual who used ASL and mouthed Spanish, I was amazed. That was a watershed moment for me. It really shook me to my core. That convinced me that ASL is a language, because this individual was signing ASL in a beautiful way, but had Spanish language on his mouth. So honestly, there's got to be a way to have ASL come out from under the English oppression that it has been experiencing historically. As I said, that really had an impact on me. And I thought, you know what? I have to talk about this and figure out different signs to use in the scientific fields without the influence of English. And I thought, you know what? This is impossible. We're going to have to fingerspell. There's going to have to be fingerspelling. I didn't believe it until I started to work on ASL Clear. That was a real challenge for me. We got deaf STEM experts together And we worked on vocabulary and concepts, and A to Z. It changed everything for me. In the beginning of that project, we noticed that, okay, deaf people have language deprivation from birth to death. And we talked about different modalities of language and how we learned language with our families and our friends as children. How do we discuss things? And your primary access to the language is ASL. Oftentimes in school, people fingerspell things and say, this is a really important word. Whereas if you were using natural language with another deaf person, you would sign the concept and understand that concept without forcing the English on the concept. So school always emphasized fingerspelling and knowing those English words. They also initialized signs often and put signs in English word order. So it was very different from natural language amongst deaf people and the school system. STEM concepts do not belong to English. English does not own the STEM concepts. STEM concepts can be expressed in ASL, in Spanish, in Russian. We have to have a separate time for English and those concepts in the STEM fields and ASL and those concepts. Both languages deserve to be honored, but one is not superior to the other. So from here on out, I decided to really take a look at the English influences upon my ASL.
Now I want to do just a brief activity with you so you can get a general sense of what it's like to be a deaf student in a classroom. I'm just going to assign one sentence, a very simple sentence, and that sentence has one initialized sign within it. That initialized sign is typically what deaf students experience in the classroom setting. I want you to watch it. Think about what that initialized sign actually is, okay? Let's watch the video. So did you say, okay, I know you're thinking. The sentence, the initialized sign was for
UW.
was the initialized sign. And what could that possibly mean? I've shown this film in the past and people give me ideas. Some people say, well, UW means underwater, or maybe, universal this or that, maybe. There are just different ideas that came in from that. So keep that in mind from initialized signs. What if that initialized sign in English is removed? What would that look like? This is the exact same sentence that I did before. The initialized sign is taken out and it is replaced with a conceptually accurate sign. Let's see if you can guess what the meaning is now. This is the sign, not UW, but this I used as a sign. Now, what could that possibly mean? I've asked people in the past and people will say, well, okay, that it seems to be connected with the water. There's the surface of the water and there's something that's moving from underneath. And maybe you notice people will get a better sense of what that possibly is as opposed to using the initials UW. Now, you just experienced two different situations, initialized and then a sign. And how does this impact students? In general, words and signs have divisions. They are split into different parts that are then put together that make up that word and or sign, and it gives it meaning. For example, we have the different parts of signs and or words. The connotation is meaning that a word has a feeling of either positive or negative or perhaps neutral. You have attack, which is more negative, or relax, which has a positive connotation. Talking about morphemes, a word is split down into smaller parts and they each have meanings. Like if you have the word automobile, means self-moving, automobile.
Association, that's where you perhaps don't know a word, but it often comes up in context with other words. Like the word accomplice. I don't know what that means, but I do recognize that it's brought up with theft or crime, so I can make that connection.
Then if a word pops up, it's within a range, people are talking, or even if it comes up in a formal speech or discussion. Grammar or grammatical form. And then context. Where does this particular sign or word come up? Is it in everyday life or science or where?
So if we look at initialized signs, U, W, if we look at all of our parts, this doesn't make sense. If we look at connotation, is it positive? Is it negative? We have no idea. Next, in terms of morphemes, splitting it in pieces, U, W, well, the information we have is we have a capital U and a capital W. Association, UW, there's a long list. Are we talking about water? Could it be a university, an organization? It could be anything.
We look at register. Well, there's many possibility things because we can see that in everyday life. And we can see it just about anywhere. In their grammatical form, UV. Does that give us anything? I have no idea. Is it a noun? Is it a verb? No idea. We have some contextual information because of what's around it. We've been talking about fishermen, talking about fishing for food, but we're really stuck. If you see initialized sign, it really it stops you. And then your brain has to try to figure out what that initialized sign means. Now, if we get rid of an initialized sign and replace it with a high quality sign that's conceptually accurate, there's all that information that a word would give you. When I do this sign, contextual. Well, something's going, doesn't seem positive or negative, so it's probably neutral. Great, that's a piece of information we have. Into morphemes, in ASL with water, we typically have our hand. So there's the horizontal hand. So there's a surface and there's something moving from underneath it. That's the morphemes we get. We can often recognize what it's dealing with, the ocean. In register, in everyday talk, if we look at that, it's like, that doesn't really pop up much in conversations, but that comes up more in the academic setting. And then grammatical form, typically in ASL. If we're talking about noun or verbs, nouns move twice, the verbs move once. So I've done that twice, that means it's a noun. I've done movement twice. And so context within the sentence, we're talking about fishermen and eating. So we have all those pieces and I can get a much better sense of what that sign means. I might not know exactly, but what it is in the process, there's a surface of the water and that water is moving and then underneath the water comes up to the surface. In English, you might wonder what the word is. It's upwelling. But that's a great sign, though. It's so easy to figure out the meaning of it. You can really get a good idea of what it is and then continue with the learning process as opposed to trying to figure out what does UW mean. So we have a word, and typically there are different parts of that word that you can figure out the word if you have the parts. And then if you have parts of one word, you can figure out if those parts are in another word, you can figure out the word from that. So you're easily making connections with all these words. And ASL, it should be the same way within ASL, which it is. If we think of a good sign that can connect to these concepts, then you can make all these connections. If you look up how is a word split into pieces, like I was just the diagram before I explained, the morphemes. Now, if we look at if a word changes or shifts topic, for example, bacteria. You know, if you're talking about a disease, this is the sign for bacteria. But if we're talking about an ocean that has bacteria in it, the sign for our human bacteria doesn't work. So we've separated it out. We've changed the sign.
Another example, the word energy. And this is the sign. We have energy in physics and biology, but they're totally different. In physics, energy does not create or destroy. It is in constant motion. And we can sign this, and that makes sense. But in biology, we're up close and looking at a very dynamic type of energy. So if I say, wow, I ran for a long time, I'm out of energy, using the physics energy sign doesn't work.
Again, if you're talking about the energy in a cell, it's a different sign for each of those contexts.
How do words relate to each other? So if we come up with the concept gene, and we sign it this way. But now there's another concept of mutation. So if you come up with some wild sign, it won't work. They have to connect to each other in some way. So you have gene, and then you have mutation. We can see the connection between those concepts.
There's a range of meanings within a word. Well, if we're talking about solids and liquids and how they can change, a good sign can show that change of energy from solid to liquid. If we use a more static sign, that doesn't work. So we have to find proper quality signs that will help ASL learners understand the concept just from seeing the sign, and that's quite powerful. So when we're disseminating these signs, we're not saying that we're purifying, that we're cleaning up ASL, and we're not getting rid of signs. That's not the intention of this. The intention is we should back up, have a good discussion, disseminate information, look at the signs that we do have, and then figure out the signs that we need. If you think of a situation, if you're in a forest, deaf people are thrown into the forest and they've been raised there. They have no concept of what a hearing person is. Would they come up with finger spelling? Would they use it? Would they use initialized signs? Of course not. I doubt it. Finger spelling and initialized signs appear only because in that moment, we're stuck for a sign. We have a concept, so we'll finger spell it, or we'll use an initialized sign. It's an easy way out. Often in general, if you look into the past, the initialized signs probably started from hearing people, probably. I do recognize that deaf people live in the real world. And that means that we live in a country where English is the dominant language, that we are surrounded by hearing people, and that English is deeply embedded into sign language. But it's important for us to just say, hang on a second, and ask ourselves, we need to cherish our language and not let English colonize it. And also some people are feeling like, well, you know, we're coming up with all these signs. You're just making them up and it's a checklist and it's false. It doesn't feel real or natural. And that's a fair question. But if we think about language and words and or signs, how they come up and when, it's when people need them. If you're talking with a person and you're describing a concept, but you don't have a sign or a word for that, that's where they come from. And that's how ASL comes up within conversation, linked to the context of everyday life. If you think about the word gas or the sign gas, we think of a car and this is the sign we use for putting our gas, but can we use that in scientific gas or gas in the air? Gas in the air is something that is matter. It doesn't have a shape. It doesn't have volume. I mean, there's a list of what a gas is, but the gas that you use in a car, you can't use that in the scientific terms of gas. We have to think about, we need a sign for that particular concept. And we have a sign. When I was growing up, I had a sign that I saw that I used, which was gas. All right, that seems okay. But again, is that effective? Does that really give you the ASL concept of what we're signing? So there are different things, there are different topics that we look at. There are solids in biology, solids, liquids, and gases. And there are a range of these, and they change their states of matter. How do we sign that? Do we sign solid, liquid, gas? Okay, that could be okay. But we've had a discussion of how do we go from those different states? So what if we get rid of those old ideas and think of the concept of what's going on? Use our intuition and think. Get rid of the word solid and change it to this. Get rid of the word or the sign liquid and change it to this. Get rid of gas and change it to this. Now I can go from a solid to a liquid state to a gaseous state, back to a liquid state, back to a solid state. It's very easy. It's a smooth transition, and the concept becomes crystal clear. That's where we need to, again, stop, take a look at everyday use of sign language, which is great, and then look at specific topics and find the unique properties of signs that we can use to convey unique properties of the concepts. So as we go along, we're learning. There are other deaf scientists out there that are finding ways to talk about this. This is so important. We want to share this information, but how can we do that?
So Alicia Wooten and I established Atomic Hands. Atomic Hands was created so many STEMists could get together and show the range of signs that can be used in the science fields.
And to disseminate videos. And we've seen that many people are watching these and thinking, yes, these new signs are fantastic. I want to incorporate them. And we've also had people that are very resistant to new signs and they don't like them. It's an interesting process being involved in this because ASL is embedded within our deaf identities because we have been oppressed our entire lives. Those of us who have used signs have been often criticized for using signs, told that we shouldn't use signs. We've grown up with that, and it's been a traumatic experience of oppression. We've gone through a lot in our lives, and to have somebody say, this sign isn't right, you're criticizing this, it's possibly telling us I'm not deaf enough, or I don't know ASL. And this is, constantly the world is changing. And we want to be able to control our own identity. So somebody from the outside telling us, no, this is the way you should do it can be a traumatic experience. So in this journey I'm going through and in going through the deaf community and trying to figure out and find ways how we can talk about language and talk about its evolution and try to change that traumatic experience into saying, yes, that this language is fluid and we can change it, and empower people through that process that we are doing it together. The signs themselves are not the only thing, but it's the framework and the collective part of signing that becomes communication, and how people collectively can come together and be able to express this. A while ago, I saw a presenter, Ben Bahan, and he was talking about his experience in communicating in academic ASL. And he was right on about what he says in this.
So what do we do in academic ASL? How do we publish in academic ASL? There's really no way to do that, no practical opportunity. We have to build an understanding, a common language and meaning. When we go to conferences and I present, as I am here, Other conference people get up and speak English. It's always in English, and I have an interpreter with me because I use ASL. So where's my opportunity to express myself in my dissertation that I wrote in ASL to the audience? How do we have those academic discussions in ASL as opposed to signing or as opposed to typing back and forth on a keyboard using English? It's very difficult to get sentences perfect in English when the information was developed in ASL. It's an interesting conundrum. How can we build recognition and a bridge between those two languages? So his experience is very common amongst deaf people. I saw that and I thought, yes, that is absolutely it. How can I, as a deaf person, there's a bunch of hearing people in the room. I'm the only deaf person there. I need other deaf people to talk about my language and to be able to express myself in ASL. That's why Alicia Wooten and I set up Atomic Hands. We want people to think about how we communicate and disseminate information. What does that look like? ASL can communicate STEM concepts. We're not willy-nilly creating signs. We're carefully analyzing the concepts and picking the signs that fit best. We don't want English to colonize ASL. We want a free ASL. I went through all of that. I moved to Oregon to attend Oregon State University, and I started my PhD studies. In Oregon, I recognized, I can analyze the power dynamics between the hearing and deaf people and the interpreters in the room. I had enough bandwidth to really take a look at that and analyze my first experiences without throwing on that academic lens. I was just having experiences. I went back to those camp experiences when I saw the kids and I would make up plays for the deaf people, for the adults to watch. And I thought about the interpreters I had all through college. And now as a PhD candidate, I was ready to really analyze and label the parts of my experience properly. I wanted to look at myself as a deaf person, a member of the deaf community, as a deaf scientist who uses ASL. Those experiences and the unpacking that I did really make me who I am. And I think I appreciate ASL so much more than I ever did. I took ASL for granted for most of my life. During my PhD studies, I really got involved in looking at ASL dynamics and interpreter dynamics in each situation I was in. My PhD focused on scientific communication, specifically in ASL. How do we communicate science via ASL? It's not signing ASL or writing in English. There's scientific language. Scientists have their own way of communicating ideas, and they have specific language that they structure to disseminate ideas. So my entire journey, I felt most of my communication and my research was done in English, and I signed it all in English word order for the interpreter. But I hadn't really tried to communicate my research in my own language. I became very confident with my English skills. I could write, and I felt like I was losing my facility in ASL. I was just signing an English word order and just working my bottom off to fry my brain and try to please whomever was in the room who could hear the interpreter speaking. So I need to honor my language. And by honoring my language, I honor myself as a professional scientist. So I decided it was time to focus on improving my ability to express myself in ASL. I am still learning today. I'm still modifying my language. I don't think I will ever reach perfection. I am still a student. I can't know everything. We all need to learn how to talk about ASL science with ASL. It's an iterative, constant experience. When I speak with my hearing colleagues, when I'm offering presentations, when I'm teaching hearing undergrads, I put a lot of effort into working on how I communicate via ASL. I want to be clear and offer those concepts visually. Always in the back of my mind, I'm thinking of different ways I can do it. I practice before I present. Afterwards, I think about how I can improve. If there's nobody deaf in the audience, I still take that opportunity to practice my academic, scientific ASL and how I can be a part of elevating that language. There's always an interesting challenge when I'm presenting in ASL. If I use ASL, sometimes the interpreters won't understand. The concepts might be misunderstood or misinterpreted. People might think that I am not intelligent enough. Honestly, I have learned that I have to let that go. It's a learning process that I have gone through, and I can work with the interpreters to give them opportunities to increase their skills in scientific ASL. And when we do that, we all improve. We're able to conduct discussions in scientific ASL that are better than ever before. And yes, there will be growing pains. We're not going to be perfect, but it's an effort that is worthwhile. So I graduated my PhD last November. I'm working as a postdoc at the University of California in Santa Barbara, UCSB. I've had a lot of focus on data analysis in marine preserves where fishing is not allowed. Is that helping? Does fishing help the proliferation of more fish species? We need to partner with other universities, the government, and other stakeholders to make sure that what we're doing is helpful to the environment. So this whole journey has led me to really unpack what is underneath in my communication toolbox, if you will. I remember last week I was in a meeting. We were on a video screen. There were 4 hearing people and 2 interpreters, and I was sharing a screen. And I showed a graph, and someone made a comment, and my eye gaze was on the graph. And someone spoke up and said, "Just a minute, stop speaking because Barbara can't look at the graph and watch the interpreter at the same time." They had good intentions for interrupting and saying that. And I had to stop things and say, I am able to multitask. And that got me thinking, like, what does it mean to successfully communicate as a scientist? Is that inability to split attention only applicable to deaf persons, or is that for hearing persons as well? Or do we have the ability to split our attention? I mean, our mental attention is always split constantly. It's been my experience. If you're maxed out on both, something's going to give, of course. Hearing people do it all the time. They'll be listening to something, watching something else. But yes, the ability to take it all in is diminished, as it is for deaf people. So we always have overlapping and competing systems of information. As long as we have a foundation of this scientific communication, it doesn't matter if we're hearing or deaf. We've moved beyond that. We're communicating as scientists. Another example that often comes up is word choice. That's a tough one. I always see a phrase come up in my field that is, and I quote, cross-section. Cross is confusing. So in ASL, it's very specific. I can't say across. That's not the right meaning of the word. So what's the right sign for cross-section if I really understand the concept? So are we going across? Are we splitting something in half? Are we dividing something? Or are we taking a whole and splitting it? So those concepts often cause some issues when we're working between ASL and English. So it's really helpful to make sure that we go back to our scientific communication language that works. sometimes misunderstandings do happen, but as long as we're aware of it, we can successfully navigate it. And I've noticed more and more of the language that we use in science. We going across something? Are we looking at a cross section of human beings, as in a variety? So it's fascinating to me that we can work together to talk about these concepts. And this has all been part of my journey. Coming first full circle again, my journey and this experience has really led me to think about some questions. There's no right or wrong at this point in my conception of this. What is a good interpreter? Someone who is familiar with the concept, someone who recognizes their level of understanding. When they're out of their depth, they will tell you. When they don't understand, they will tell you. They have the ability to recognize signs and words choice in a grammatically intelligent way so that they're using the proper signs as opposed to just word salad, if you will. When there's two groups and there's an interpreter in the middle, of course, there's a cultural difference. So there's going to be some social mediation that has to happen. For example, hearing people tend to hate silence. The hearing person is finished speaking, the interpreter is still working on the interpretation and will then interrupt before the interpreter is done. And likewise, the deaf person might interrupt a hearing person because they're not realizing that they're still speaking. So interpreters are really critical for cultural mediation to help both groups work together in a more productive manner. We need to recognize when interpreters work with you, who they are, where they're from. We also need to talk about power dynamics. We need to consider the communication and work on that communication together because we are two separate language groups with a mediator, the interpreter, in the middle. It's important that interpreters are trained with communications and strategies. So we lean on them and we need them for their expertise in those areas. The priority, of course, is transparency, honesty. I cannot emphasize that enough. You have to share your process. When you're struggling, you have to share that. Be transparent with your own process. If you are out of your depth, admit it. We can all do certain things and can't do other things. And that's okay. We're working with communication. And sometimes those interpreters are put in a situation in which they're not ready for that communication. So we can work together collaboratively as a team for better success. Interpreters should not just show up and leave when the job is over. We need to talk about these things, talk about how the concepts can be signed more clearly. Qualities of a good interpreter. So as a deaf person, if I'm lecturing, I will sit with an interpreter for hours and explain the content of my presentation, and they can practice moving that ASL presentation into a spoken English interpretation. But we don't expect them to do the same thing for hearing presenters. They simply look at notes, good enough, and get on the way. And for the deaf person in the audience, that's extra responsibility or extra work that I'm doing as an audience member. So I've started to ask interpreters, if there's a hearing presenter, I want the interpreter go and sit down with a hearing interpreter, discuss those concepts, practice using the signs that are most conceptually accurate for that presentation. And then when I go to the presentation, I have the best access possible.
Now I want to talk about the role of the deaf person in STEM. My answer, a deaf STEMist. There's more of us coming into the field. There are many of us now that are using ASL in the field, but we really haven't explored that area. And now we have an opportunity to really dig deep and set up and set a way that will prepare the future for more deaf STEMists. And how can we elevate them? How can we elevate our ASL in STEM, we need to think about how we're communicating. We have to think about sign choices and talk about STEM issues. That conversation has to happen in ASL. And what can it look like in STEM? We don't want to be, again, colonized by the English. We need to elevate our language and empower our deaf people. We have that language. We just have to figure out how to communicate it to improve it. And how do we make this so we can use ASL without hearing influence, without interference from English? To do all this, we have to establish a path for future STEMists who are deaf. I personally can talk about my experience, but a lot of time I'm alone as a deaf scientist in a group of hearing people. We need to get together a group of good signers who are STEMists, who are experienced within their communication. That way I can relax, sit back, and that experience will be just typical. So I want that to become the everyday instance. ASL in STEM. Again, like I mentioned, we need to break free of the English hold that has on us. Set that aside. Set aside any signs that hearing people have come up with in the past. Wipe the slate clean and start anew with a fresh eye and think how we can use ASL in our way. And we know we can do that in a correct way. Not just picking the right signs, but how we can express ourselves in ASL. There's a good use of visual space. This is what, the STEM concepts fit in perfectly with our use of space within the language. I think perhaps better than other linear languages, spoken languages. We have to work on how we can successfully communicate science across the fields, across culture, across language barriers. We have to find those common fundamental basics of communication. And that will help us to get together to figure out, what's causing any divides amongst us. What's making us go, oh, I'm just tired of this. So how can we invite other people in the process and work on this together? So in a nutshell, ASL is a living, breathing entity, constantly changing as long as people are using it. ASL, there are hearing people who don't understand our language and our culture who have been oppressive to us. Deaf people have this innately within ourselves, and therefore we have the responsibility to pass that on. ASL, as ASL feeds us, we feed ASL. It's our communication. It's how we speak to one another. It's how we pass exact ideas and concepts onto each other. ASL is in a beautiful community. And how can we feed that ASL? We have to step back and think about the question of why is language developed in the first place? We have a concept and we need a way to communicate that naturally and easily. That's how language comes up. So we don't need to make it hard for ourselves to constantly be finger spelling and initializing things into English. That's not innate. We need to feed ASL by taking advantage of its strengths and growing the language and being able to empower each other that will let us grow. So through my journey, I'm constantly asking myself this question. And I want you to ask yourselves this. What can ASL do for us? And what can we do for ASL? How can we gather together, recognize, cherish the role that ASL has, the gift that it is, and continue it and uplift it in a way that will expand it? How can we uplift the deaf community with it? How can we uplift the hearing community? How can we uplift the STEM community with ASL? That will just help us expand our collaboration and expand our ASL as well.
I just want to say thank you so much for your time and attention and your thoughtful questions. I really hope that the future we can be more collaborative in honoring ASL. Thank you so much.